Over the past few centuries, humans have found themselves in completely unfamiliar conditions. For tens or even hundreds of thousands of years, their perception of themselves and the world was mythological. Critical thinking and reliance on facts and logic were the domain of a select few. The modern era can be called the age of rational thought and scientific discovery, but I've often come across the idea that this rather successful attempt to, let's say, reprogram humanity initially led to some glitches. Under the weight of knowledge, even in the most developed countries, people's minds in the second half of the 20th century started drifting back toward the irrational. This resulted in the rise of magic, the occult, and to some extent, the fantasy genre. These stories usually depict worlds without modern technology but filled with fantastical creatures, magic, and the like. In a way, such works simulate childhood, where a person discovers an entirely new world from scratch. On top of that, these settings often feature constant danger, monsters, battles, elements that, for most of human history, were just part of everyday life. With the rise of video games, which by now are familiar to every other person on the planet, many have adopted a medieval theme. Of course, truly historically accurate games are rare. Most fall into the fantasy category, which creates a certain issue since the gaming industry influences both ideological views and perceptions of the past and present. But this video isn't here to claim that game developers know nothing about history, weapons, or armor. More often than not, they are simply following established trends and techniques designed to attract players. So things like infamous chainmail bikinis, oversized weapons, or Viking helmets with horns don't necessarily come from ignorance. This video is just a bit of nitpicking, a chance to highlight some details that don't quite align with historical reality. In fact, if you try to pinpoint the exact historical period of most games, you'll likely conclude that they take place in a kind of late medieval setting. This happens because developers want to include as wide a variety of weapons and armor as possible. As a result, even if a game world leans more toward the early or high medieval period, you'll still find two-handed swords from the 14th century, or even full plate armor that appeared after firearms. Speaking of oversized weapons, they do look impressive. Some players even assume they were real. But historical one-handed weapons, even impact weapons, rarely exceeded 2 kilograms, and two-handed ones generally stayed within 3 or 4. That's because doubling speed increases striking energy fourfold, whereas doubling mass only doubles energy. A hammer weighing 2 kilograms, if accelerated from 10 meters per second to just over 12, will hit harder than a 3-kilogram hammer at 10 meters per second. So, people didn't chase mass. That's basic physics. But for people in the past, it was just practical sense. That's why javelins were replaced by lighter, faster arrows, and later, by even lighter and faster bullets, whose energy is roughly 10 times that of a massive spear due to sheer velocity. Often, for the sake of spectacle in games, using 2 swords becomes popular, even though there are no real historical examples of 2 long-bladed weapons being used in combat in the Middle Ages. Near the end of the sword-fighting era, there were schools that taught fencing with 2 rapiers, but they never became widely popular. On a similar note, the classic blade-on-blade parrying we see in movies is more of an early modern combat technique when swords became lighter and metal quality improved. For a medieval sword, every clash against another blade was a serious risk. But this is more of a movie issue than a game one. Probably for the sake of coolness, many games, especially those inspired by assassin archetypes, hugely overestimate the combat potential of daggers. The problem is developers often ignore attack reach or only implement it in a very limited way. In reality, if you were armed with a dagger, you'd likely never get close enough to strike someone wielding a longer weapon. Similarly, bows and crossbows couldn't be kept drawn indefinitely without damaging them. But that's a minor gripe. Arrows, even in the high medieval period, were quite expensive. In 14th century England, a dozen arrows cost around 15 pence, which was roughly equivalent to more than 50 liters of ale or the price of a whole sheep. In games, though, arrows usually cost next to nothing. But in real life, a few minutes of non-stop shooting could easily rack up expenses equal to the price of a cow. So prolonged and constant barrages were probably rare. Massive or nearly infinite ammo supplies just weren't a thing. And of course, no game is complete without some stylish, dramatic leather armor. While this type of protection was seemingly popular among nomadic cultures, historical evidence of its use in Europe is scarce. In fact, multi-layered leather armor could actually be heavier than metal. Soft, tanned leather is more of a clothing material than proper protection. Layered fabric armor was far more common in medieval Europe, and naturally, full-plate armor provided actual, not just symbolic, defense against swords and arrows. That said, I wouldn't risk swimming in it. Sure, there are successful experiments with swimming in chainmail, but even that takes serious effort to stay afloat. Another thing to keep in mind, producing steel, or rather steel-infused iron, in a bloomery was extremely labor-intensive with a lot of waste. So games where acquiring new weapons or armor is a difficult and expensive process are actually closer to reality. Before the Industrial Revolution, anything made of metal was valuable, but weapons, armor, and combat mechanics often take a back seat to gameplay balance. More important is the world itself. If it's set in a medieval-inspired setting, it should function under the rules of feudalism. And no matter where you look, east or west, feudal societies were built on rigid class structures. There's a saying, "You belong where you were born." In feudal times, it was more like, you stay what you were born as. In early medieval Europe, social mobility existed, and birth status wasn't always a deal-breaker. But by the high medieval period, that changed. Families who had once been granted land, and with it, titles, held on to them for generations, locking others out. So the classic game trope where a commoner or an unknown outsider is knighted. That was even less likely than a random person off the street today being appointed as a government minister. In a class-based society, lineage mattered far more than personal skills. The odds of being born into the feudal elite were roughly 1 in 100. Nearly every game world is packed with cities. But even in the early modern era, urban populations in the most developed parts of Europe made up only about a quarter of the total. During the Middle Ages, estimates range from as low as 2 to 5%. Literacy rates, meaning the ability to read and write, were also extremely low. If we traveled back in time, we'd see endless villages and only the occasional small town. Strangely enough, even if some enemy force hypothetically wiped out every city in a given country, it wouldn't drastically affect the total population. That's because medieval cities were more about trade and craftsmanship than housing large numbers of people. And for most of the medieval period in Europe, feudal nobles didn't live in cities. They lived in isolated castles, which were passed down through generations. Speaking of which, getting a hold of money as a peasant, which accounted for more than 90% of the population, was a real challenge. The urban population was tiny. Lords took a share of the harvest for free. Peasants largely produced their own food. With that in mind, selling crops wasn't exactly easy. Inns and merchants in every village might be convenient for gameplay, but in reality, selling something often meant traveling hundreds of kilometers. And as for finding an inn, for most of the medieval era, good luck. Such establishments only became common in the late Middle Ages, and even then, mostly in cities.